Section 9 of Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullen. Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2, by William Henry Wilkins, Section 9. Chapter 9. Frederick, Prince of Wales. There was another, a more dangerous enemy, whom Walpole could not touch, and of whose dislike he was at this time not fully aware, the Prince of Wales. Throughout the excise agitation, the prince had silently and stealthily worked against his parents and the Prime Minister. He had now become more familiar with the position of affairs in England, and had learnt the importance of his position in the state. The prince was a constant source of trouble to the king, nor was the blame wholly on Frederick's side. The Queen urged the advisability of giving the prince a separate establishment, and went to look at a house for him in George Street, Hanover Square, but the king stubbornly refused to give the necessary money, and so Frederick had perforce to live with his parents in apartments in one of the palaces, and to be a daily recipient of his father's slights. Such a position would have been trying for the most virtuous and dutiful of sons, and the prince was neither virtuous nor dutiful. Moreover, though Parliament granted the king £100,000 for the Prince of Wales, yet Frederick received only a small allowance from his father, and even that was uncertain. Under these circumstances he quickly accumulated debts which the king refused to pay. The Queen interceded for him, but in vain, and she received no gratitude from her son, who resented, as far as he dared, her being appointed regent in the king's absence instead of himself. As he was entirely dependent on his father for money, he did not venture to make a public protest, but he cherished a grudge against his mother for superseding him. With all these grievances, Frederick soon followed his father's example of caballing against his sire, and he found plenty of sympathy from those who were in opposition to the court and the government. He had not been long in England before an opportunity was afforded him of playing to the popular gallery by an unpopular demand of the Crown to Parliament, to make good a pretended deficiency in the civil list of £115,000. It was really a veiled form of making the king a further grant. The measure was violently opposed by the opposition, but Walpole succeeded in carrying it through the House of Commons. A great deal of ill feeling against the court was produced in the country by this extortionate demand, and the Craftsman did its best to fan the flame of discontent. The Prince of Wales, who was exceedingly sore at his father's meanness toward him, pretended to disapprove of the king's conduct in making this demand, and was inconsiderate enough to say so to certain personages, and his words, repeated from mouth to mouth, did not lose in the journey. Pulteney and Bolingbroke and other prominent members of the opposition quoted with approval what the prince had said, and condoled with him on the way in which he was treated by his father. The rumour of this reaching the king's ears incensed him the more against his son, but he could not act merely on hearsay. He had no tangible ground of complaint against him, for the prince was cautious. Another cause which drew the prince towards the opposition was his liking for literature and talent. He seems to have had a genuine taste for les belles lettres. He wrote poetry in French and English, some of it not absolutely indifferent. The cleverest writers sided with the opposition, and the polished periods of Bolingbroke, the eloquence of Wyndham, and the wit of Chesterfield and Pulteney all appealed to him. Bolingbroke especially gained influence with the prince, and in time became his political mentor. Apart from the political aspect of the union, there seems to have been a sincere friendship between the two. Soon after Frederick came to England, Bolingbroke made overtures to him, to which the prince responded graciously, and the first interview between them, a secret one, took place by appointment at the house of a mutual friend. Bolingbroke, who was the first to arrive, was shown into the library, and was passing the time by turning over the leaves of a bulky tome. The prince entered the room unannounced. The book fell to the floor, and in his haste to bend the knee, Bolingbroke's foot slipped, and had not the prince stepped forward to support him, he would have fallen to the ground. "My lord," said Frederick, with exquisite tact, as he raised him, "I trust this may be an omen of my succeeding in raising your fortunes." The prince had charming manners which he inherited from his mother, and he had other gifts which won for him popularity, notably his generosity, which verged on extravagance. He had that easy and affable address which sits so well on royal personage, and he was popular with the people. It pleased them to see the heir apparent walking about the streets unguarded, and followed only by a servant, and Frederick had always a bow and a smile for the meanest of his father's subjects, who recognized him. The prince's chief favourite and counsellor was George Budd Doddington, a curious man, whose geniality and vanity were in marked contrast to his political intrigues. He was the nephew of Doddington, one of the wealthiest landowners in England, whose sister had made a mésalliance with one Bubb, an apothecary of Carlisle. On the death of Bubb, his widow was forgiven, and her son George succeeded to his uncle's vast estates, and assumed the name of Doddington by royal licence. As he owned 2 boroughs, he entered the House of Commons and attached himself to Walpole, but on being refused a peerage by that statesman, he turned against him. He made the acquaintance of the Prince of Wales soon after his arrival in England, and threw in his lot with him. Doddington was a useful friend to the prince in many ways, for in addition to his social qualities and knowledge of men, his wealth was of use. Doddington not only placed his purse at the prince's service, but suffered himself to become the butt of Frederick's not very refined jests and practical jokes. He submitted, says Horace Walpole, to the prince's childish horseplay, being once rolled up in a blanket and trundled downstairs. Nor was he negligent of paying more solid court by lending his Royal Highness money. Frederick once observed to some of his boon companions, "This is a strange country, this England. I am told Doddington is reckoned a clever man, yet I got £5,000 out of him this morning. He has no chance of ever seeing it again." But Doddington was keenly alive to the social distinction which the prince's friendship conferred upon him, and no doubt received what he considered an equivalent for the money. In the prince's next move for popularity, Doddington played a passive part. He was generally understood to represent the prince in the House of Commons, and when therefore he declined to speak in the House in favour of the excise, it was regarded as a proof of the prince's lukewarmness, and when another favourite, Townsend, who was the groom of the bedchamber to the prince, actually voted against the scheme, it was understood that the prince was hostile to it. Wyndham emphasised this in one of his attacks on Walpole. He denounced corruption and tyranny, and recalled certain unworthy king's favourites of former times. What was their fate, he asked. They had the misfortune to outlive their master, and his son, as soon as he came to the throne, took off their heads. The Prince of Wales was sitting under the gallery listening to the debate, and the allusion was cheered to the echo by the opposition. The prince's attitude was further shown by his exceeding graciousness to Lord Stair, who had told the Queen his mind, and to Lord Chesterfield, who had offended her, past forgiveness. The king was exceedingly angry and threatened to turn Townsend out of the little appointment he held under the prince, but Walpole counselled letting him alone, Walpole would have punished Doddington had he dared, for he regarded him as the chief instigator of the prince's rebellious conduct. This was most unfair, for Doddington's advice was always on the side of caution, and his influence had more than once prevented the prince from rising in open revolt against his parents. Walpole forgot for the moment that behind the prince was one much greater than Doddington, whose enmity never slept, and that one was Bolingbroke. Though debarred from his seat in the House of Lords, and unable to raise his voice or vote, Bolingbroke yet, by his genius for intrigue, the vigour of his political writings, and his consummate power of organisation, had done more than any man to stir up public feeling against the excise, and to bring Walpole within measurable distance of his fall. Most of the opposition were puppets moved by this mastermind. Wyndham was his mouthpiece. Even Pulteney at this time was wholly under his spell. And under the ordinary working of the Constitution, Bolingbroke would have led his host to victory had not the King and Queen, unconstitutionally, it must be admitted, retained their Prime Minister. Meanwhile, though the prince was proving himself a thorn in the side of his father and the government, and though the opposition championed his cause with fervour, he could not get his allowance increased, and he sank deeper and deeper into debt. It came to the ears of old Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, that the prince was in pecuniary distress, and she bethought herself of a scheme which would at once gratify her ambition and wound the feelings of the king and queen. She asked the prince to honour her with a visit to Marlborough House, and when he came, she offered him the hand of her favourite granddaughter, Lady Diana Spencer, in marriage, and promised to give him £100,000 as her portion. Lady Diana was a young lady of much wit and beauty, and the prince, partly because he wanted the money, and partly because he knew the alliance would anger his father and mother beyond measure, accepted the offer. All arrangements were made. The day of the marriage was actually fixed, and the prince was to be secretly wedded to Lady Diana by Duchess Sarah's chaplain in the Duchess's private lodge in Windsor Great Park. The Royal Marriage Act, which made illegal the marriage of a member of the royal family without the consent of the reigning monarch, was not then in existence, and the marriage, if it had been contracted, would have been valid and impossible to annul, except perhaps by a special act, which would have had no chance of passing through Parliament. There would have been nothing objectionable about the marriage, except its secrecy, for Lady Diana Spencer, who afterwards became Duchess of Bedford, was by birth and fortune, as by wit and beauty, far superior to the petty German princess whom the prince afterwards married. But Walpole got to hear of the plot in time, and was able to prevent the marriage. It is a pity that it did not take place, for the subsequent interview of the parents with old Duchess Sarah on the one side, and Queen Caroline on the other, would have been one of the most interesting in history. An early and congenial marriage might have been the saving of the Prince of Wales. Like his father and grandfather, he affected a reputation for gallantry, and he was always involved in affairs of a more or less disreputable nature. He behaved more like a schoolboy than a prince, arrived at years of discretion. Peter Wentworth gives an account of one of his absurd escapades. He writes, "Thursday morning, as the king and queen were going to their chaise through the garden, I told them the prince had got his watch again. Our farrier's man had found it at the end of the mole, with the 2 seals to it. The queen laughed and said, 'I told you before, 'twas you who stole it, and now 'tis very plain that you got it from the woman who took it from the prince, and you gave it to the farrier's man to say he had found it to get the reward.' This was 20 guineas, which was advertised with the promise of no questions being asked. I took Her Majesty's words for a very great compliment, for it looked as if she thought I could please a woman better than His Highness. Really, his losing his watch, and its being brought back in the manner it has been, is very mysterious, and a knotty point to be unravelled at court, for the Prince protests he was not out of his coach in the park on the Sunday night it was lost. But by accident I think I can give some account of this affair, though it is not my business to say a word of it at court, not even to the Queen, who desired me to tell her all I knew of it, with a promise that she would not tell the Prince. And I desire also the story may never go out of Wentworth Castle again. My man John Cooper saw the Prince that night let into the park through St. James's Mews alone, and the next morning a grenadier told him the Prince was robbed last night of his watch and 22 guineas and a gold medal by a woman who had run away from him. The Prince bid the grenadier run after her and take the watch from her, which, with the seals, were the only thing he valued. The money she was welcome to, he said, and he ordered him, when he had got the watch, to let the woman go. But the grenadier could not find her, so I suppose in her haste she dropped it at the end of the Mall, or laid it down there for fear of being discovered by the watch and seals, if they should be advertised. The Prince also followed his forebears' example in setting up an accredited mistress. His first intrigue was with Miss Vane, the beautiful Vanilla, daughter of Lord Barnard, and one of the Queen's maids of honour, who, it was wittily said, was willing to cease to be one on the first opportunity. Miss Vane had many admirers. Lord Harrington was one of them, and Lord Hervey declared himself to be another. But Lord Hervey was fond of posing as a gallant, and his testimony on the subject of his conquests is of little worth. Miss Vane had a good deal of beauty, but little understanding, and her levity and vanity led her into a fatal error. About a year after the Prince had come to England, she gave birth to a son in her apartment in St. James's Palace, and the child was baptized in the Chapel Royal and given the name of Frederick Vane, which was, of course, tantamount to explaining to all the world that the Prince of Wales was its father, a fact which the Prince in no wise sought to deny. Queen Caroline at once dismissed Miss Vane from her service and sharply reprimanded the Prince, telling him that in future he must carry on his intrigues outside the circle of her household. No such scandal had occurred since the disgrace of Miss Howe. Miss Vane's family likewise cast her off. The Prince took a house for her and made her an allowance, but the unfortunate girl soon had experience of the fickleness of men in general, and of princes in particular. Frederick neglected her, and began to pay marked attentions to Lady Archibald Hamilton. Lady Archibald was no longer young, she was 35, and the mother of 10 children, and unlike Miss Vane she had no great beauty, but she was clever and intriguing, and soon gained great ascendancy over her royal lover, whose attentions to her became of the most public description. He, says Lord Hervey, saw her often at her own house, where he seemed as welcome to the master as the mistress. He met her often at her sister's, walked with her day after day for hours together, tete-a-tete, in a morning in St. James's Park, and whenever she was at the drawing-room, which was pretty frequently, his behaviour was so remarkable that his nose and her ear were inseparable. Miss Vane had small chance with so clever a rival, and Lady Archibald urged the Prince to get rid of her. In this the Queen concurred, for she resented the indiscretion of her ex-maid of honour, and as there was some thought of marrying the Prince at this time, she thought it best that he should be clear of affairs of this kind. She did not reflect, or did not know, that by getting rid of Miss Vane she was merely paving the way for a far more dangerous woman to take her place. The Prince was easily persuaded to part with Miss Vane. he sent Lord Baltimore, one of his lords-in-waiting, to her with a message desiring her to go abroad for 2 or 3 years and leave her son to be educated in England. If she complied, the prince was willing to allow her £1,600 a year for life, the sum he had given her annually since she had been dismissed from court. If she refused, the message wound up by saying that if she would not live abroad, she might starve for him in England. The unfortunate young lady was much hurt by the matter and manner of the communication. She declined to send any answer by Lord Baltimore on the ground that she must have time to think. Lord Hervey says that she then sent for him and asked him as a friend to advise her what was best to be done. He and Miss Vane composed a letter to the prince in which the betrayed lady was made to say to her betrayer, "Your Royal Highness need not be put in mind who I am, nor whence you took me, that I acted not like what I was born. Others may reproach me, but you took from me happiness and brought me to misery, that I might reproach you. That I have long lost your heart I have long seen, and long mourned. To gain it, or rather to reward the gift you made me of it, I sacrificed my time, my youth, my character, the world, my family, and everything that a woman can sacrifice to a man she loves. How little I considered my interest. You must know by my never naming my interest to you when I made this sacrifice, and by my trusting to your honour, when I showed so little regard, when put in balance with my love to my own. I have resigned everything for your sake but my life, and had you loved me still, I would have risked even that too, to please you. But as it is, I cannot think in my state of health of going out of England, far from all friends and all physicians I can trust, and of whom I stand in so much need. My child is the only consolation I have left. I cannot leave him, nor shall anything but death ever make me quit the country he is in." When Frederick received this letter, instead of being touched by its pathos, he flew into a rage and swore that the minx could never have written it, and he would be revenged on the rascal who helped her to concoct it. He took all his friends into his confidence, and Miss Vane took all hers, and the matter soon became the principal topic of conversation at court, from the Queen and the princesses downwards. Miss Vane gained much sympathy by repeating the prince's brutal message that, if she would not live abroad, she might for him starve in England. Everybody sympathized with her, and everybody blamed the prince, who thereupon threw over Lord Baltimore and declared that he had never sent such a message. He must have been misunderstood. On hearing this, Miss Vane, acting on the advice of Pulteney, who was thought by many to have written for her the first letter, and other friends, wrote a more submissive letter to the prince. In it she declared that she had certainly received the message from Lord Baltimore, though she could hardly believe that it came from the prince's lips. It was for him to show whether he had said those words or not. If he had not, she felt sure he would treat her fairly. If he had, then all the world would know how she had been ill-treated and betrayed. Meanwhile, the affair, from being the gossip of the court, became the talk of the town, and ballads and pamphlets on the fair Vanilla were everywhere circulated, under such titles as Vanilla on the Straw, Vanilla or the Amours of the Court, Vanessa or the Humours of the Court of Modern Gallantry, etc. The prince, seeing that he could not abandon the lady without considerable discredit, at last agreed to settle on her £1,600 a year for life, to give her the house in Grosvenor Street, which she had occupied since she had been dismissed from court, and to allow her son to remain with her. In short, he yielded all her terms. Poor Miss Vane did not long enjoy her fortune. Perhaps she really loved her faithless wooer. She died at Bath soon after. Her friends said of a broken heart. Her child died about the same time. The Queen and Princess Caroline declared that the prince showed more feeling at the loss of this child than they had thought him capable of possessing. Perhaps it was remorse. The two elder princesses, Anne and Amelia, were always quarrelling with their brother. Amelia at first pretended to be his friend, and then betrayed him to the king. When the prince found this out, he hated her, and when the king discovered it, he despised her, so she became disliked by both. Anne, Princess Royal, was at perpetual feud with her brother, and their strife came to a head, strangely enough, over music. The princess had been instructed by Handel, and helped him by every means in her power. When Handel took over the management of the opera at the Haymarket, the princess induced the king and queen to take a box there and to frequently attend the performances. All those who wished to be in favour with the court followed suit, and the Haymarket became a fashionable resort. The prince saw in this an opportunity of annoying his sister, and of showing disrespect to the king and queen. He affected not to care about Handel's music, and set to work to organise a series of operas at the theatre in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Party feeling ran very high just then, and seeing that the Prince of Wales was so much interested in the opera at Lincoln's Inn Fields, many of the opposition, and all those who had a grudge against the court, made a point of attending the opera there, and it soon became a formidable rival to the Haymarket. Instead of ignoring this, the king and queen took the matter up and made it a personal grievance. They patronised Handel more than ever, and made it a point that their courtiers should do the same. Thus it came about that all those who appeared at the Haymarket were regarded as the friends of the king and queen, and all those who attended Lincoln's Inn Fields were looked upon as the prince's friends. Opposition is always popular, and the prince managed to gather around him the younger and livelier spirits among the nobility, and the most beautiful and fashionable of the ladies of quality. Certainly Lincoln's Inn Fields was much more patronised, and the king and queen and the Princess Royal would often go to one of Handel's operas at the Haymarket and find a half-empty house. This gave Lord Chesterfield an opportunity of uttering one of his witticisms. One night when he came to Lincoln's Inn Fields, he told the prince that he had just looked in at the Haymarket, but found nobody there but the king and queen, and as I thought they might be talking business, I came away, he said, a joke which vastly pleased the prince and greatly incensed the court. Referring to the large attendance of peers at Lincoln's Inn Fields, the Princess Royal said with a sneer that she expected in a little while to see half the House of Lords playing in the orchestra in their robes and coronets. Conscious of failure, she felt extremely bitter against her brother and abused him roundly. But the prince had won and could afford to laugh at his sister's invectives. The court was so deplorably dull, he said, that all those with any pretensions to wit, beauty, or fashion refused to follow its lead and looked to him, the heir to the throne, as their natural leader, notwithstanding the way in which he was treated by the king and queen. Certainly the private life of the court was far from lively. The clockwork regularity of the king, both in business and in pleasure, and the limited range of his amusements and interests tended to make his court appallingly dull, in contrast to the old days at Leicester House. Mrs. Howard, whose little parties had once been so popular, now withdrew more and more to herself. She would probably have retired from court altogether, had it not been that by the death of her brother-in-law, her husband became Earl of Suffolk. As she was now a countess, she could no longer hold the inferior position of bedchamber woman, and placed her resignation in the Queen's hands, who, however, met the case by making her mistress of the robes, and so retaining her about the court. Lady Suffolk had no longer to perform the duties at the Queen's toilet, which had given her so much umbrage, and her position became pleasanter in consequence of the change. We find her writing to Gay a little later. To prevent all future quarrels and disputes, I shall let you know that I have kissed hands for the place of Mistress of the Robes. Her Majesty did me the honour to give me the choice of Lady of the Bedchamber, or that which I find so much more agreeable to me, that I did not take one moment to consider it. The Duchess of Dorset resigned it for me, and everything as yet promises more happiness for the latter part of my life than I have yet had the prospect of. 7 nights, quiet sleep, and 7 easy days have almost worked a miracle in me. Even Lord Hervey complained bitterly at this time of the monotony of his daily round. He was dissatisfied, and considered that his services to the government and the crown should be repaid by some more considerable appointment than the one he held, which most people thought equal to his abilities, and was certainly in excess of his deserts. But Walpole, who knew how useful Hervey was as go-between, would not remove him from his post about the Queen, notwithstanding his representations. Chafing under this refusal, Lord Hervey wrote the following letter to his friend Mrs. Clayton, another courtier and favourite who could sympathise with him in his ennui. It gives anything but a flattering picture of the royal circle. I will not trouble you with any account of our occupations at Hampton Court. No mill horse ever went in a more constant track, or a more unchanging circle, so that by the assistance of an almanac for the day of the week, and a watch for the hour of the day, you may inform yourself fully, without any other intelligence but your memory, of every transaction within the verge of the court. Walking, chaises, levees, and audiences fill the morning. At night the king plays at commerce and backgammon, and the queen at quadrille, where poor Lady Charlotte de Russy runs her usual nightly gauntlet, the queen pulling her hood, Mr. Schutz sputtering in her face, and the Princess Royal rapping her knuckles, all at a time. It was in vain she fled from persecution for her religion. She suffers for her pride what she escaped for her faith, undergoes in a drawing-room what she dreaded from the Inquisition, and will die a martyr to a court, though not to a church. The Duke of Grafton takes his nightly opiate of lottery, and sleeps as usual between the Princesses Amelia and Caroline. Lord Grantham strolls from one room to another, as Dryden says, like some discontented ghost that oft appears and is forbid to speak, and stirs himself about as people stir a fire, not with any design, but in hopes to make it burn brisker, which his lordship constantly does to no purpose, and yet tries as constantly as if he had ever once succeeded. At last the king comes up, the pool finishes, and everybody has their dismission. Their Majesties retire to Lady Charlotte and my Lord Lifford, the princesses to Bilderbeck and Loney, my Lord Grantham to Lady Frances and Mr. Clark, some to supper and some to bed, and thus, to speak in the scripture phrase, the evening and the morning make the day. Lord Hervey may have been prejudiced, but independent testimony comes from Lady Pomfret, who was then in attendance at court. She writes, "All things appear to move in the same manner as usual, and all our actions are as mechanical as the clock which directs them." End of section 9.